Every air disaster is news, but one of the most horrifying scenarios is a crash where a pilot is accused of bringing down the plane deliberately. Such is the case with SilkAir Flight 185. This is a story of confusion and conflict, of detective work and scientific deduction. And above all, it is the story of the pressure investigators come under to determine the cause of a crash, however shocking their conclusions might be. In the early days of 1998, a voice recorder is recovered from the mud of the Musi River in Indonesia. Crash investigators hope it contains a record of one of the most controversial disasters in aviation history. 20 days earlier, the crew of SilkAir Flight 185 are heading along the walkway to their aircraft, a Boeing 737, to make it ready for the short hop back to Singapore. They've already completed an uneventful first leg from Singapore to Jakarta. It's a perfect day to fly. The Soekarno-Hatta International Airport in the Indonesian capital Jakarta has blue skies with scattered clouds. "97 passengers are joining Flight 185 for the 1 hour 40-minute journey to Singapore. They come from 14 different countries, the oldest passenger 77, the youngest 2. They're heading to Singapore during this holiday travel season. The voice recorder reveals that everything is completely routine in the cockpit.
4.7 unit check. 00, 4.7, checked. Takeoff briefing, complete. And it's complete to the line.
Both pilots have extensive flying experience. Captain Sioux Ming was a top fighter pilot with the Singapore Air Force before moving to SilkAir. First Officer Duncan Ward has over 2,000 hours flying experience. The atmosphere in the cockpit seems relaxed.
Just give me 115 seconds to put on the infancy belt, you know.
Never mind, it can take quite some time. You can pick up to 3 seconds.
The last passengers board the aircraft, and the doors are closed. Captain Sioux and Duncan Ward carry on with normal cockpit conversation as the aircraft makes its way to the main runway.
Line up and wait, SilkAir 185.
They are also talking to the control tower to obtain clearance for takeoff.
Airborne right turn, Papa Lima Bravo. Cleared for takeoff, SilkAir 185.
That clearance comes at 3:37, and shortly after that, Flight 185 is airborne. Jakarta Air Traffic Control assigns the 737 a cruise altitude of 35,000 feet. And as the aircraft passes through 19,000 feet, Captain Sioux starts the familiar welcome routine.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
This is your captain. My name is Sioux Ming. On the flight deck this afternoon with me is First Officer Duncan Ward. The seatbelt sign is now off. Feel free to move around the cabin. However, while seated,
For your own safety, have your seatbelt fastened.
Everything about the flight is normal and routine.
drinks are we drink.
Passengers and the flight crew are offered a light meal and drinks.
Just a couple. Some water, you want? Fine, thanks.
28 minutes into the flight.
Go back for a while, finish your plate.
Oh yeah?
Some water?
No thanks.
This is the last conversation recorded on the cockpit voice recorder of Flight 185. But an exchange between the control tower and Duncan Ward is recorded in Jakarta some 5 minutes after that final conversation between Captain and First Officer. It's not known whether Captain Sioux has returned to the flight deck at this stage, but Duncan Ward responds to the call, giving no indication of any problem on board.
185, roger. 134.4 before party.
Just over a minute later, Indonesian radar shows the plane beginning a rapid descent. It drops 15,500 feet in just 30 seconds before disappearing from the radar screen. Planes are designed not to crash, and yet they do. And some of the world's top aviation minds are employed to find out precisely why. The air crash investigators.
As an investigator, you hope that you can bring some positive to light out of a very tragic circumstance. My goal has always been, I want to enhance aviation safety.
On December 19, 1997, SilkAir Flight 185 disappears from the radar screen while on a routine flight from Jakarta to Singapore. There's no emergency call from the crew.
I was working, and then the plane came from that side. It made a sound like rah, and then it made a U-turn to that side and crashed into the river with a big boom and a water splash.
The village of Sukamaju sits on the bank of the Musi River near Palembang in Indonesia. This peaceful setting is shattered when Flight 185 smashes into the river just hundreds of yards from this small community. The villagers immediately launch their boats, but find only small pieces of debris and personal items. There is no trace of the 104 people aboard the aircraft. Very soon, investigators and relatives of passengers arrive at the remote crash site. It's clear to all that no one could have survived the devastating crash. It's time for the air crash investigators to begin their painstaking work.
In the beginning, I saw nothing. It was completely underwater, and you have to know that after that we found out that the aircraft was completely destroyed. Completely destroyed.
Professor Duran heads up the Indonesian Investigating Authority, now known as the National Transportation Safety Committee. He's joined by a team of experts from America's National Transportation Safety Board.
The NTSB had a lot of background in 737 investigations, especially in the recent past, because of a multiple of accidents that occurred with the 737 aircraft.
It's a formidable team of investigators, facing a formidable challenge.
This was a very unique accident. I'd seen high-speed destruction of aircraft that had struck the ground, but there were large pieces of that aircraft left. In this particular instance, because of the speed that the airplane impacted the water, it was total devastation, total destruction of that aircraft.
The first impulse is just to cry after I've seen the wreckage. There was no big parts. The biggest parts is about 40 by 40 centimeters.
Recovering the wreckage is an impossible task for divers alone. Huge dredgers are brought in to scoop up tons of mud from the riverbed, where thousands of aircraft fragments are embedded. Any one of these fragments could hold vital clues. Of paramount importance, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, the two black boxes that record every detail of every flight.
If the box has stayed intact, it has what's called a pinger on it, but it's only good for 30 days. So it's a race against the clock to find those two boxes.
Days of searching and dredging the muddy river bottom turn up nothing but shattered aircraft fragments. But on the fifth day after the crash, as divers grope their way through the mud-filled water, the first breakthrough. The flight data recorder box is found. And as if by a miracle, a dredger brings up the cockpit voice recorder 15 days later. The black boxes are dispatched with Professor Duran's blessing to the US for analysis. Meanwhile, the job of identifying and assembling the fragments continues. 73% of the plane's wreckage is recovered, and is yielding vital information to investigators. Some will suggest that this was the path of SilkAir 185 as it left normal flight. In the space of just 4 seconds, it flips onto its back. Inverted, it cannot maintain altitude, and begins its plunge, corkscrewing towards the ground. As the plane approaches the speed of sound, fragments of the tail and wings are torn off. The whole incident is over in about a minute. The investigators are also interested in the 737's tail and rudder system. In particular, the component at the heart of the rudder assembly. The rudder is moved by the Power Control Unit, or PCU, but problems have been previously reported with this unit. As soon as it's recovered from the river, it's sent to the US for inspection. But other wreckage fragments are yielding some shocking information. Both engines were set to full speed at the time of the impact, and flight controls were set in such a way as to point the nose of the aircraft down. It looks as though the pilots have been powering directly down towards the ground and not trying to pull the plane from its deadly dive. Meanwhile, news begins filtering back from the States. Firstly, the rudder power control unit and servo valve are returned with a clean bill of health. More intriguing are the findings about the plane's flight recorders. They're not revealing the data they should. The experts have found that the cockpit voice recorder stopped recording about 8 minutes before the crash, and the flight data recorder stopped 6 minutes later.
The cockpit voice recorder had a unique signature. That is, it stopped recording, but not necessarily from the normal power outage that you'd expect. It was that the circuit breaker, the power had actually been removed from the box itself.
I remember sitting at the NTSB headquarters when it became apparent that the power to the recorder failed. And I was a new boy there, and I asked the question. I said, does this happen very often? One of them said to me, no. He said, this has never happened. This is bizarre. Now we have to consider pilot suicide.
The investigators are reluctantly drawn towards the unthinkable. pilot's error is always one of the primary areas of crash investigation, but what is unfolding here is the chilling possibility that Captain Sioux deliberately crashed Flight 185. Sioux had been a fighter pilot with the Singapore Air Force for 16 years before joining SilkAir. He was considered a top gun in the Air Force, eventually joining the Black Knights, the Air Force's aerobatic display team. Investigators delved into Sioux's Air Force history and found he had several brushes with death. Reaching the rank of Major, Sioux decided that civil aviation offered him the chance to keep flying and spend more time with his family.
Quite a few military pilots are task-oriented, and sometimes they have difficulty moving into civil aviation where safety is much more paramount, but I didn't see any problems like that with Sioux.
Sioux Wei-ming left the Air Force in 1992 for SilkAir, where he was fast-tracked into the captain's seat, and then later promoted to instructor pilot. But he ran into professional problems just months before the crash. SilkAir questioned Sioux about an unorthodox landing. Shortly after this incident, he turned off a cockpit voice recorder, but switched it on again before takeoff at the first officer's insistence. Captain Sioux was reprimanded by SilkAir and demoted from his instructor's position. The investigators are beginning to...
At least for them.
It's a large step to considering that Captain Sioux committed suicide, and in doing so, to conclude that he also murdered 103 innocent people. The families of the victims return to Indonesia for a funeral service. The coffins are symbolic. They are being buried empty, as virtually no body parts could be recovered from the river. The grief of the relatives is a palpable reminder for the investigators. The families need answers.
Why happened a new airplane become like that? You know, why that plane? What happened to, you know?
Betty's daughter was Bonnie Hicks, a well-known model and author in Singapore. She was on her way to a family holiday with her American boyfriend. Although desperate to know why the plane crashed, Betty could not accept the pilot's suicide theory.
I don't believe from start. I don't believe. Don't blame him, because for goodness sake. He's got wife, he's got children, you think he do that?
It's always hard to try and rationalize why somebody would intentionally do something to harm him or herself and, of course, passengers in the back of the airplane. And while you don't want to believe it, and you want to try and focus your energies on disproving it, it does become reality at a certain point, and then you have to accept it and then work through it.
Along with Sioux's professional problems, investigators are also beginning to uncover a man in financial difficulties. There are reports that Sioux's stock market trading account had been suspended twice just prior to the crash, owing his brokers over $100,000. Rumours also circulate that Sioux had taken out a life insurance policy that came into effect the day of the crash. Figures of up to $3 million are reported.
All of a sudden, you start to build this picture that this pilot is surrounded in a black cloud. Things are starting to collapse. They're starting to implode.
They're piecing together a picture of a man on the brink, capable of anything, overwhelmed by financial pressures brought on by a money-obsessed lifestyle. As the circumstantial evidence mounts, the suicide theory starts to spread through the media, putting more pressure on the Indonesian lead investigator.
The allegations were very loud, you know, from the press and the people, and especially from the next of kin.
If the theory that Captain Sioux brought down the plane deliberately is correct, it's likely he'd asked the first officer to leave the flight deck, or otherwise disabled him. Peter McMillan says this would have been necessary, as Sioux would need all of his force to put the 737 into its deadly dive.
Okay, we're cruising at 35,000 feet. To achieve this trajectory, we disconnect the auto throttle, which will bring up a warning here. Then we disconnect the autopilot, which will bring up another warning up here. Roll the aeroplane to the right, all the way over, into it nose down. That's 20 degrees nose down. The air thrust is now almost inverted, and full forward stick is turned, and the stabiliser trim is wound full forward. And you can see the pressure that I've got to hold on here. If I let it go close to the cutter, the instantaneous vertical speed is almost off the clutch. You can see the altitude unwinding. Now this throttle freeze just went out, that's a whiplash.
But there is no direct evidence for this sequence of events. 3 years after the crash, Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee, the NTSC, finally issues its report. It contains nothing concrete for the families. No cause can be found for the crash.
I came in front of them, I asked them to come, and I say, forgive me, I cannot find the real truth. I couldn't find. I did my best.
This inconclusive report is a shock to the American team. At their final meeting with their Indonesian colleagues, there seemed to be agreement on a single conclusion to the report: pilot suicide.
When I read that report, I felt deflated, because we had put so much energy into developing all of this information painstakingly. Look at little parts, pieces of wire that are only this big, thousands and thousands of these little pieces, looking at all of this stuff over a long period of time, months and months and months, only to have this report come back and say, we don't know what caused this accident. As an accident investigator, I can't accept that.
As an engineer, I would like to have a one-to-one connection, cause and effect. I didn't see the cause and the effect. I see only an effect. The aircraft went down. I don't know what the cause is, and I cannot prove that the cause of the accident going down, the aircraft going down, was a suicide. It would be also a mechanical failure.
We did have a reason for it. We did identify that reason, and it was an intentional act, not a physical problem with the airplane, and it wasn't an unknown. We did have a known.
In an unprecedented on-page spat, the NTSB and the NTSC comments and counter-comments are published and incorporated into the final report. Instead of clarifying the crash, this report simply brings further confusion to the families of the victims.
And for them, they can't understand. You've done all this, you've spent all this money, you've got all this expertise, and you can't figure out what happened? They can't close. They can't justify in their own mind why their loved one was killed.
So many professors come down, already tell you, we don't know what happened. All the experts already said, cannot answer. How do I answer?
With the investigation ending after 3 years, doors are closing for the families of the victims. The only theory they have? Pilot suicide. But across the Pacific in Los Angeles, a lawyer experienced in air disaster cases is skeptical. For him, pilot suicide makes no sense.
Dead men can't defend themselves. There was nothing left. There was nobody to talk about what happened in that cockpit.
If Captain Sioux did not bring down the plane, then it has to have been a mechanical fault, he argues. And so he begins his own investigation.
It was the world's first passenger jet, the ultimate in British engineering and luxury. So when two Japanese bombers crashed in quick succession, killing everyone on board, Britain's supremacy in commercial aviation crashed with them. How could it happen? Now National Geographic Channel investigates the tragedy that stunned the nation. Seconds from disaster, comet air crash, Friday at 9:30, National Geographic Channel.
One man's pilgrimage, 10,000 miles through war-torn regions, hostile situations, harsh terrain. To walk where the biblical characters once walked, to experience their stories where they first began. Witness the Bible's teachings brought to life. Reading the Bible, coming soon on National Geographic Channel.
LA lawyer Walter Lack is skeptical that the pilot of doomed SilkAir Flight 185 intentionally crashed the plane, killing all 104 people aboard.
There are so many easier, more reliable means of disabling an aircraft. He could have dumped all the fuel and they would have gone down within seconds. He could have done any number of other things. This is really not the way, if you're going to pull it off, to do it.
So he has launched his own investigation on behalf of 32 of the victims' families. The 737 is the world's most popular aircraft, with more than 4,800 taking to the skies since it was first introduced in 1967. But it's not been entirely without problems. Lack's suspicions have been aroused by comparisons between this crash and two others. United Airlines 585 in 1991 and US Air 427 in 1994.
The history of this aircraft definitely had the power control unit for the rudder system high on the suspect list.
Behind the unit in question, Parker Hannifin, one of the world's largest manufacturers of hydraulic equipment. Walter Lack calls in experts, father and son team Don and Colin Summer, who have experience in the aviation industry, and in testifying on behalf of crash victims.
SilkAir came in the wake of both the United 585 crash in Colorado Springs and the US Air 427 crash in Pittsburgh. We were also charged with investigating those crashes.
This is the Camarina plot from the flight path through the radar data, and then to put each one of those animations side by side, and the similarities are remarkable.
In the case of UA 585 and US Air 427, the NTSB concluded that the most likely cause of the crashes was a problem with the rudder's power control unit, or PCU. Even though the two crashes in America happened as the 737s were on approach to landing, the Summers are convinced that a similar rudder hardover caused the Silk airplane to roll and dive from its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. 737 pilots had been advised of this problem, and the flight manual indicated how to react in the event of an uncommanded rudder hardover. Both Captain Sioux Ming and First Officer Duncan Ward received this extra training.
In a simulator, a pilot knows that it's coming. He knows what the routine he's supposed to run through is. When the pilot is in cruise flight, as in SilkAir 185, he is not expecting this type of action. He's not expecting the aircraft to roll over. And now he's in a position where he's hanging by his seatbelt. He's trying to figure out what happened. And the fact is that in the 737, there is no warning. There is no indication as to where the rudder panel is. And there is no light, no sound, no hint to the pilot that something has gone wrong with the rudder.
Because of the history of rudder problems in the 737, the maker of the PCU, Parker Hannafin, was put on standby right after the crash to help identify recovered wreckage. Lack and his team claimed that Parker found the PCU, but their tests didn't uncover the whole story.
They sent a GO team immediately to go locate this thing, and they found it 20 foot below water, buried in the mud. It took them 3 weeks to recover it.
And they gave it kind of a cursory look and said, we don't find anything wrong with this valve. It seems to be functioning perfectly normal. And then they sent it back to the NTSC.
They did everything except the proper tests to determine whether there were defects in it.
The unit was sent back to Indonesia. Now, 5 years later, if Walter Lack is to have his case, he will need to locate this one small component. But there's a hitch. The investigator sent to look for the part finds that all that remains of SilkAir 185 is a mountain of paperwork. The wreckage itself has been destroyed just weeks before. But fate is to take a hand.
We learned about a safe in the office of the NTSC.
After much persuasion, the investigator is granted access. And indeed, lying in the safe is a single remnant of the SilkAir crash. And not just any remnant.
It was the actual servo valve that's been the focus of our attention.
Finding the power control unit is a remarkable breakthrough, the one piece from all the many thousands that the investigators needed. A unit the size of a soft drink can, the only part still in existence from the SilkAir 737.
This is a dual concentric servo valve, as manufactured by Parker Hannafin. And inside the valve are two servo slides. The interior slide is known as the primary slide, and that primary slide has tiny little lands on it, and in those lands, hydraulic fluid is ported. The secondary slide, which rests inside the housing, also has lands on it.
This valve is part of the 737's hydraulic system. When a pilot steps on a pedal, a hydraulic impulse passes down the length of the plane to the valve, which activates the rudder mechanism, turning it to one side or the other.
The movement of each of these slides in either direction is only about the thickness of a small coin. So in order to move the entire rudder surface of a Boeing 737, this little valve only moves 45 thousandths of an inch in either direction.
This precision device has built-in redundancy. Each slide is supposed to take over if the other should fail.
The problem that was discovered is that if the secondary slide becomes jammed, the rudder will go to a hard over position and the pilots cannot return it to neutral.
Lack's prosecution makes the case that the valve on the SilkAir 737 has a history. They find paperwork showing the valve failed a test after it was manufactured. Parker contends that the test in question would not affect the function of the servo valve, and that after further inspection, it was passed and installed in the SilkAir 737.
Considering the history and how many crashes there have been, I would have thought that people would have been much more interested in the dual concentric servo valve and the signatures left inside it than they were.
Now that the PCU has been retrieved, it's sent to a specialist lab in Florida for more testing. The unit is examined using a scanning electron microscope, a device that enables higher magnification, larger depth of focus, and greater resolution than a conventional light microscope.
We spare no expense and we spare no time to absolutely prove a point is either true or not true. Many times we wind up in the court system, and when you're in the court system, you better have your ducks in a row, because there's going to be some people asking you some pretty hard questions.
This component is virtually hand-finished, in order to make it as smooth as possible when the part was shipped to Boeing. But the prosecution claims these metal burrs or shavings were left over from the manufacturing process. These microscopic flecks seem insignificant. But according to Walter Lack's expert Colin Summer, the fate of an entire 56-ton aircraft may depend on these tiny shavings of metal.
But this marked the start of the captive breeding project.
Tight tolerances and such a snug fit between all these components is that they are very, very intolerant of any kind of impurity that is running through the system. Any kind of a metal chip, any kind of a burr, any kind of an imperfection during manufacture causes a huge effect on tolerances of these sizes.
Walter Lack's team are convinced that they now have the forensic chain of evidence proving the valve brought the plane down. But still, there is evidence for suicide that Lack hopes to refute.
If he was going to commit suicide, why didn't he do it on his way down? Why did he wait till the way back? He had his wife waiting for him at the airport. The last thing he told her was, "We'll pick me up at 4 in the afternoon. We're going to get in about 3:45. This flight was completely normal in every way. You can tell from the conversation, even with the interaction of the flight crew, the stewardess who came out, they were kidding with each other. There was nothing morose about the behavior, nothing out of the usual.
and the police investigation into Sioux's financial background revealed he had taken share losses of more than $1.2 million. But at the time of the crash he was solvent, having sold 2 properties and had a net worth of nearly $350,000. And the multi-million-dollar life insurance policy, allegedly taken out days before the crash, was actually a policy to cover the $570,000 mortgage on his new house, a standard banking requirement. But one of the strongest arguments in favour of the theory that the captain intentionally brought the plane down was the fact that both black boxes on board the plane stopped recording before the crash. The claim was that he had switched them off deliberately to cover his actions. But not everything on board the plane was as it seemed. The 737 was a new plane, just 10 months old. When it was delivered, it came with a state-of-the-art solid-state flight recorder.
SilkAir apparently replaced the original flight data recorder with this unit that rode to the crash.
Walter Lack's investigators finally get hold of the data recorder 6 years after the crash, and their analysis raises new questions.
This was an old, tired unit that had failed to record more than 4,000 seconds of data across 60 parameters in the last 25 hours prior to the crash, which would include the 12 flights prior to the accident flight.
According to their analysis, some of the stoppages are as short as 4 seconds, some as long as 11 minutes. This flight data recorder was consistently switching itself off. To Lack and his team, it looked like the case for suicide by Captain Sioux and the murder of 103 innocent people was diminishing fast. That far from crashing the plane deliberately, the pilot and co-pilot were engaged in a desperate bid to save the aircraft in their dying seconds.
The pilot and the co-pilot would have been more than likely going through the steps that they had been trained to do to determine what had happened to the aircraft to try and correct for that action. One of the discoveries of the engine power as well as the trim of the aircraft showed that the engines were near full power when it hit the ground.
In fact, Boeing issued instructions in their flight manual to perform these actions in the event of a rudder hardover. But in the case of SilkAir, some believed that the plane flipped onto its back in less than 5 seconds, and nothing more could be done. This was enough to take to the Los Angeles Superior Court. Over 6 weeks, the jury hear a formidable array of evidence from both Walter Lack's team and experts brought in by the manufacturer, Parker Hannifin.
How was it that within 8 hours of this accident, somebody called you at home here in Los Angeles to tell you about the crash? There's over 100 different manufacturers of component parts on this aircraft. How are you on somebody's speed dialer?
The 737 has a pretty significant history of uncommanded rudder movements.
Why did power fail to the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder?
Power had actually been removed from the box itself.
If one of those pilots on the flight deck was intentionally disabling those 2 black boxes, why didn't he disable them both at the same time?
So what you're telling me, sir, and what you want this jury to believe, is you've made 5,100 of these servo valves, and not one of them ever contained a manufacturing defect.
We were able to determine that there was interference between the secondary slide and the housing of the valve.
And within 3 to 4 seconds, it reaches 90 degrees, completely on its side. All bets are off.
A descent like that, with those parameters, requires deliberate pilot input.
It is much easier to try and blame the pilot.
Every year, family members and friends of those who died in the SilkAir crash of 1997 returned to the crash site near Palembang in Indonesia. The families have formed a bond with the people of Sukamaju, who were witnesses to the tragedy. It's another station in their annual pilgrimage, and they always bring gifts.
I know the village of people are very poor, so I just want to bring something for them. The poor kids, they're nothing. You know, why can't bring something for them, make them happy? And the moment I feel good, they're happy. The body like me to do that also.
It's a part of coming to terms with what has happened, letting some good come from the tragedy. After 4 days, the jury in the case brought in LA on behalf of 3 families returns to the courtroom.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the following special verdict on the following questions submitted to us. Did the servo valve contain a manufacturing defect when it left Parker Hannifin's possession? Answer, yes.
There were 187 questions that had to be answered, and every one was yes in favor of the plaintiffs and against Parker Hannifin. That type of total victory is unheard of, even in these other cases where large amounts are awarded.
The jury awards the 3 families nearly $44 million in damages.
Was it a large amount of money? Unquestionably, yes, it was. Was it fair compensation for the evidence we put on? It was 100% justice. It's the kind of case they built the courthouse for.
After threatening to appeal, Parker Hannifin makes a call. Although the company denies any liability for the crash, it agrees to settle with all 91 families involved. This will cost them an undisclosed amount. Nevertheless, some experts remain convinced that Captain Sioux deliberately crashed the plane in a spectacular suicide.
The evidence, the facts, conditions, and circumstances support that that airplane was physically capable of being flown by the pilot. I firmly believe that it was an intentional act and not a physical problem with the airplane.
The fact is that we will never know exactly what happened in the cockpit in the last minutes of SilkAir Flight 185. But after a series of incidents with uncommanded rudder hardovers on 737s, the Federal Aviation Administration have ordered that all 737s, thousands of them, have to replace the original rudder control components with newly designed systems with extra built-in redundancy by 2008. The day after the families have been to the village, they go to the memorial that has been erected to the dead of SilkAir Flight 185. It's a time for contemplation and for communing with their loved ones.
When I see the Bonnie, ask her to give me help. Ask Randy to take care of Bonnie, Bonnie take care of Randy. They are in another world. I still love them.
For Betty, the settlement payments are of little interest.
I never feel better. I'm so lonely, right? Nothing to hope, nothing to look forward. My life anymore. Even you give me 10 million, 20 million, so what? I'm alone.
What consolation there is lies beyond the answers and the justice. It's making some small good come